For 21 nights, the man in room 317 did not move, did not speak, did not so much as flutter an eyelid, and the hospital staff had stopped expecting him to. They called him a vegetable behind closed doors. They called him a ghost in front of his guards. What they did not know was that somewhere behind that stillness, a man who had survived 4 bullets and built an empire on fear was clawing his way toward consciousness, one sound at a time. And the sound that kept pulling him back was not a machine, not a doctor's voice, not even his own name. It was a woman who had no idea who he was, talking to him every night about a toddler's bedtime, a broken refrigerator, and a debt she could not pay. She thought she was talking to herself. She was wrong. And 3 floors below, in a parking garage that smelled like rain and gasoline, 2 men were studying a photograph of her face, deciding exactly how useful she might become. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We're so glad you're here for this one. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you do not want to miss where this story goes. Christiana Reed ran the last 2 blocks to Seoul Central Hospital with her sneakers slapping wet pavement and her badge already clipped crooked to her scrub top. Because if she clocked in even 90 seconds late again, Mrs. Pack would write her up, and a write-up meant a points deduction, and a points deduction meant losing the shift differential she desperately needed to make rent. The eviction notice was folded into a tight little square in her back pocket, soft now from being unfolded and refolded a dozen times since yesterday, like maybe if she read it enough times the number at the bottom would shrink. $4,700. She had 11 days. The hospital lobby swallowed her in fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee, and she swiped her badge at the staff elevator with one hand while shoving her hair into a bun with the other, breathing hard, counting the seconds. The doors opened on the 3rd floor, and Mrs. Pack was already there, arms crossed, lips pressed into the thin, disapproving line that Christiana had come to know better than her own reflection. "You're late," Mrs. Pack said, not even looking up from her clipboard. 90 seconds, Christiana said. "I ran the last." "New assignment." Mrs. Pack finally looked at her, and something in her expression made Christiana's stomach tighten, the way it did whenever someone was about to hand her a problem disguised as an opportunity. "Room 317, minimum disturbance protocol." Christiana blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means you go in, you do exactly what's on the card, and you don't touch anything that isn't on the card. You don't talk to security. You don't ask the patient questions. You don't look at his chart. You're in and out in 11 minutes every night, same time." Mrs. Pack finally met her eyes, and for just a second something flickered there, not quite warning, not quite pity. "And Christiana, whatever you hear about that room from the other girls, don't repeat it. Just clean it." "Hear what?" But Mrs. Pack was already walking away, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum, leaving Christiana standing outside a door with a small brass placard that read 317, and beneath it, a laminated card zip-tied to the handle that she would come to memorize over the following 3 weeks. A list of careful, specific instructions written by someone who clearly expected this patient to never wake up, and clearly wanted to make absolutely sure that if he did, no one outside this room would ever know it had happened. She had no idea, pushing that door open for the first time, that the man behind it could already, faintly, hear the click of the handle. That somewhere in the black water he'd been drowning in for 3 weeks, a small sound had just registered as different, as new. She had no idea that 2 floors down, a man in a charcoal suit with a small gold hawk pinned to his lapel was reading a report that listed every staff member with clearance to enter room 317, and that her name had just been added to the bottom of that list. The room was dim, lit only by the soft blue glow of monitors and a bedside lamp turned low. 2 guards in dark suits stood outside the door, not hospital security. Christiana was sure of that, and neither said a word as she passed, though she felt their eyes track her the whole way down the hall. In the bed lay a man, younger than she expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp features gone slack in sleep and skin marked from collarbone to wrist in ink. Dragons curled across one shoulder, geometric patterns wove down his forearm, and on his left hand sat a small tattoo of a hawk. A breathing tube rested in his nose. The monitors ticked along in slow, even rhythm. The card on the door read, "Wipe down surfaces. Do not adjust bedding. Do not speak to patient. Report any visible changes to charge nurse only." He looked so alone. No flowers, no photographs taped to the wall, none of the little shrines families usually built. Just monitors and silence, and a man covered in art that told a story no one in this room wanted to hear. She got to work, wiping down the windowsill, refilling the sanitizer dispenser, moving quietly the way 3 years of night shifts had trained her body to move even when her mind was somewhere else. Tonight her mind was on the number 4700. On Blue, asleep at Mrs. Oyler's down the hall. On the landlord's voicemail, polite in the way that was somehow worse than yelling. She didn't mean to start talking. It just happened, the way it did when she was alone and exhausted. She talked to herself in the shower, muttered grocery lists, folding laundry. It was just background noise. Just Tuesday. "You'd think after a double, the last thing I'd want to do is talk," she said quietly, wiping the windowsill harder than it needed. But here we are. The monitors beeped on, unchanged. "My daughters too," she said, and something about there being a person in the room, even an unconscious one, made it feel less like talking to herself. "Blue, last week she put her stuffed rabbit in the toilet to give it a bath, and I had to dry it with a hairdryer at 11 at night while she cried because Mr. was cold." She almost smiled at the memory. She's a good kid. She doesn't deserve. She stopped, didn't finish it. Some sentences were too heavy to say out loud, even to a man who couldn't hear them. What Christiana didn't know was that something, somewhere beneath the stillness, had just shifted. For 3 weeks there had been nothing for Jumong. Not sleep, not quite, but a kind of suspended drifting, sounds arriving distorted, like trying to hear through 6 feet of water. Voices had come before. Doctors, clinical and distant. Words like prognosis and minimal brain activity, sliding past like debris in a current, none of them anchored to anything, none of them for him. But this voice was different. This voice was talking about a rabbit in a toilet. And in the black water Jumong had been drowning in, something turned, slowly, like a body rolling over in sleep, toward the sound. He didn't wake. He couldn't. But for the first time since 4 bullets had nearly ended him, he was no longer simply drifting. He was listening. Night after night, the voice came back. Christiana didn't know she was doing it, talking through the eviction notice, through Blue's daycare falling through the slow arithmetic of a life that never quite added up. But in the dark, those fragments were the only solid things Jumong had. A toddler's laugh, a mother's exhaustion, a world entirely outside the one he'd built, where loyalty was bought and silence was a weapon, and no one had ever simply talked to him because the room felt too quiet. He found himself, in whatever strange half-place he existed in now, waiting for her voice the way a drowning man waits for air. And 3 floors below, in an office with the blinds drawn, a man named Kang Taesung set down a folder with Christiana Reed's photograph clipped to the front, looked at a tired woman smiling faintly for an ID badge, and said quietly to the man standing across from him, "Find out everything about her. Family, debts, routines, everything." The man nodded once and left. Kang Taesung looked at the photograph a long moment, then allowed himself something close to a smile. "Good," he murmured. "Now we wait and see how useful you really are." The fever started small. Christiana noticed it the moment she picked Blue up from Mrs. Oyler's that morning. A warmth against her neck that felt wrong, too even, too steady, the kind of heat that didn't come from running around or crying. By the time she'd gotten Blue home and into pajamas, the thermometer read 38.6. By the time Christiana had to leave for her shift, fed Blue medicine, and called every favor she had left, it was 39.1. And by 1 a.m., when Mrs. Oyler called her cell phone in a near whisper, voice tight with worry, Blue's fever had climbed to 39.8. "She won't stop crying," Mrs. Oyler said. "I gave her more medicine, but it's not bringing it down, Christiana. I think you need to come." Christiana stood in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, phone pressed so hard to her ear it hurt, and did the math she always did. The math she'd promised herself, after the eviction notice, after everything that she would stop doing. Emergency room copy, 380,001, money she did not have. Urgent care if it was even open at this hour, still more than her entire week's pay. A fever that high in a toddler wasn't something you waited out. She knew that. Every cell in her body knew that. "I'm coming," she said and hung up and ran. She signed out early, lied, said she felt sick, watched Mrs. Pack's eyes narrow with suspicion, but not enough to stop her, and took a cab she couldn't afford to Mrs. Oyler's building, and found Blue burning hot and limp in a way that made Christiana's chest cave in. 39.8. Lethargic. Barely crying anymore, which was somehow worse than the crying. There was a clinic 2 blocks from the hospital that did walk-ins for cash. No insurance required, but it didn't open until 7 a.m., and it was 2:15, and Blue's skin felt like a stovetop under Christiana's palm. And that's when Christiana thought of room 317. It was insane. She knew it was insane the moment the thought formed. 317 was climate-controlled, quiet, monitored by machines that tracked vitals around the clock, minimum disturbance protocol. Do not speak, do not touch, do not breathe too loud in that room. But it was also 3 floors up from where she stood, and it was the one place in this entire building where, for 11 minutes a night, nobody else came in. She wasn't thinking about the man in the bed. She wasn't thinking about consequences, or her job, or the guards outside the door. She was thinking about a thermometer reading 39.8 and a clinic that didn't open for 5 more hours, and somewhere underneath all of it, without fully admitting it to herself, she was thinking, if anyone is going to notice me bringing my daughter into a hospital at 2 in the morning, I would rather it happen in the one room where, for some reason, nobody ever checks on anything. She wrapped Blue in a blanket, badge already in her pocket, and went back. The guards outside 317 had changed shift. New faces, younger, less sharp, and either didn't recognize the protocols well enough or simply didn't expect a cleaning woman to be carrying a sleeping toddler at 2 in the morning, because they let her pass with barely a glance. Christiana slipped inside, heart hammering so loud she was sure it would wake the entire floor, and shut the door behind her. The room was exactly as it always was, dim, quiet, monitors humming their steady rhythm. The man in the bed lay motionless, just as he had every night for 3 weeks. Blue whimpered against Christiana's shoulder, hot and miserable, and Christiana stood frozen for a moment in the middle of the room with nowhere to put her down. The single chair was hard plastic. The floor was cold tile, and Blue needed warmth, needed to stop crying, needed. Christiana's eyes landed on the bed, on the broad, motionless chest beneath the thin blanket, rising and falling in slow rhythm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, to no one, to everyone, to a man who couldn't hear her. "Just for a minute, just until she calms down." She laid Blue gently on the man's chest, on top of the blanket, cradling her there with one arm, and immediately, almost instantly, Blue's whimpering softened. The rise and fall of his breathing, slow and steady, seemed to soothe her in a way nothing else had all night. Christiana felt tears prick at her eyes from sheer exhaustion and relief, watching her daughter's small body settle against the chest of a stranger who would never know any of this happened. For nearly a minute, the room was silent except for the monitors and Blue's slowing breath. Then the door opened. A nurse stepped in, not one of the regular night staff, someone Christiana didn't recognize, doing a rounds check that wasn't supposed to happen for another 2 hours, and froze in the doorway, eyes going wide at the sight of a cleaning woman standing beside the bed of Seoul Central's most carefully guarded patient, with a small child lying on his chest. "What?" the nurse started, already reaching for the radio clip to her shoulder, already stepping forward to grab Blue, to remove this catastrophic breach of protocol before anyone important found out. "You can't get her off." And in the half-second before the nurse's hand closed around Blue's arm, something happened that no machine in that room had measured, predicted, or even believed possible for 3 weeks. The man's hand moved. Not a twitch, not a reflex. A hand that had not lifted itself from a hospital bed in 21 days shot upward and closed, gently, but with absolute, unmistakable intention, around the nurse's wrist, stopping her cold. Christiana stumbled backward, a strangled sound catching in her throat. The monitors began to scream. And very slowly, for the first time in 3 weeks, the man in room 317 opened his eyes. The alarms didn't stop. They climbed. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, every monitor in the room screaming numbers that had been flatlined for 3 weeks suddenly surging back to life all at once. And for several seconds nobody moved, because nobody in that room could quite process what they were looking at. Ju Mong's eyes were open. Not glassy, not unfocused, not the slow blinking confusion of someone surfacing from anesthesia. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the speed of a man who had spent his entire life walking into rooms and immediately identifying every exit, every threat, every variable. And they landed first on the nurse whose wrist he still held, then on the small child lying against his chest, and then, finally, on Christiana, frozen by the door with both hands pressed over her mouth. His grip on the nurse's wrist didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt her, but enough to make absolutely clear that he was not confused, not disoriented, not acting on some primal reflex. He was making a choice. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough, broken from 3 weeks of disuse, barely above a whisper, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a man used to being obeyed. The nurse stared at him, then at the small girl breathing slow and even against his chest, then yanked her radio up with her free hand. "Code blue, room 317, patient is conscious." "She's sick," Ju Mong said, each word costing him visible effort, his gaze fixed on the nurse with an intensity that made her go still. "Not contagious, fever, that's all." His eyes flicked just for a second to Christiana. "Let her stay." The nurse looked between the man, whose vitals had been flatlined for 3 weeks, and the toddler asleep on his chest, clearly trying to decide which fact was more impossible. And in that frozen second the door burst open and the room filled. Doctors, a crash team, the 2 guards from outside, all of them shouting over each other, and Christiana found herself shoved backward against the wall, blue suddenly ripped from the warmth of Ju Mong's chest and into the arms of a doctor checking her temperature. And everything became noise and light and panic. She caught Ju Mong's eyes one more time, just before someone pulled the privacy curtain between them. He was looking directly at her, and for the briefest moment, something passed across his face that didn't belong on the face of a man who just woken from 3 weeks of darkness into a room full of strangers shouting medical terminology, something that looked, impossibly, like relief. Christiana spent the next 4 hours in a waiting room down the hall, Blue's fever finally breaking under proper IV fluids and medication. Both of them safe, both of them fine, and both of them, Christiana was absolutely certain, about to be fired, arrested, or both. Mrs. Pack arrived at 6 a.m., pale and furious, and didn't even get a full sentence out before a man in a suit. Not one of the guards from outside 317. Someone new, older, carrying himself like every word he said had already been pre-approved by someone more important, stepped between them. "Ms. Reed," he said, not unkindly. "Mr." He paused very deliberately. "The patient in 317 would like to speak with you, if you're willing." Mrs. Pack's mouth opened and closed twice. Christiana, heart in her throat, holding a now sleeping, fever-free Blue against her shoulder, followed the man back down the hall. Room 317 looked different in daylight. Curtains open, monitors quieter, and Ju Mong sitting upright against a stack of pillows, IV still in his arm but oxygen tube removed, looking tired and pale but unmistakably, terrifyingly awake. He looked at Blue first, still asleep, color back in her cheeks, and something in his shoulders eased just slightly. "She's better," he said, not a question. "Yes," Christiana managed. "Thank you. I don't know what happened. I shouldn't have. I'm so sorry. I'll pay for. I know this room is special. I didn't mean to." "Sit down," Ju Mong said. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't a request either, and Christiana found herself sitting in the hard plastic chair before she'd fully decided to. "You talk to me," Ju Mong said slowly, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Every night for 3 weeks." Christiana's stomach dropped through the floor. You could hear me. Not at first. He looked down at his own hands, the IV line, the hawk tattoo on the back of his left hand, like he was seeing them for the first time. Then yes, your voice was the only thing that was. He searched for the word, and something in his expression suggested he didn't often need to search for words. Real. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside the door, Christiana could hear Mrs. Pak's voice rising and falling in agitated Korean, clearly being managed by someone. I have to ask you something, Jumong said, and I need you to answer honestly. The eviction notice. $4,700, 11 days. Christiana went cold. How do you? You said it out loud, more than once. His eyes didn't waver. Is it still true? She didn't answer right away. Pride, the same hyper-independent pride that had carried her through 3 years alone in a foreign country with a toddler and no support system, screamed at her to lie, to say it's handled, to walk out of this room with whatever dignity she had left. Yes, she said quietly, it's still true. Ju Mong nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he already knew, and reached for a phone on the bedside table. A phone Christiana was fairly sure hadn't been there an hour ago, and made a single call, speaking quietly in Korean, too fast for Christiana to follow beyond a handful of words. When he hung up, he looked at her again. By tomorrow morning, your hospital wage will be adjusted, retroactively and going forward, and your daughter's medical care, all of it, anything she needs, will be covered. Christiana stared at him. I know. No, I can't. I don't even know your name. I can't accept. It's not charity, Ju Mong said, and for the first time, something almost like amusement flickered across his exhausted face. Consider it. Back pay. For 3 weeks of work I couldn't have survived without. That's not how hospital wages work. It is now. Christiana opened her mouth to argue further. Because this was insane, because nothing about this made sense, because a man covered in tattoos who apparently had enough power to alter hospital payroll with a single phone call was not a man whose help came without strings. Every instinct she had screamed that. But before she could say another word, the door opened again, and a man stepped inside. Mid-40s, sharp gray suit, and pinned to his lapel, small and gold and unmistakable, a hawk. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ju Mong, the man said smoothly, his eyes flicking once, briefly, dismissively, over Christiana before settling back on the man in the bed. His smile didn't reach his eyes. You're awake! We were all so worried. Ju Mong's expression didn't change, but Christiana felt the shift in the room like a pressure drop before a storm. And for the first time since she'd walked into this room 3 weeks ago, she understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that whatever world she had just stumbled into, it was far more dangerous than an eviction notice. The man with the hawk pin, Christiana would learn his name soon enough, but in this moment he was simply danger given a tailored suit, crossed the room slowly, each footstep deliberate, and stopped at the foot of the bed. Kang Ti-sung, Ju Mong said before the man could speak again. His voice was still rough, still recovering, but something in it had changed, gone flat, controlled, the voice of a man recalculating everything in real time. You came quickly, faster than I'd expect for someone who just learned I was awake 5 minutes ago. Ti-sung's smile didn't waver. Word travels fast in this hospital, especially good news. Is it good news? The question landed in the room like a dropped glass, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief Christiana almost missed it, something flickered behind Ti-sung's eyes. Calculation. Recalibration. The look of a man who had spent 3 weeks quietly rearranging an empire around the assumption that its owner would never wake up, and had just been handed proof that the assumption was wrong. Of course it is, Ti-sung said smoothly. The council will be relieved. There's been some instability, questions about leadership, given the circumstances. I've been managing things in your absence, but naturally, now that you're... I'll review everything, Ju Mong said. Personally, every decision made in the last 3 weeks. He held Ti-sung's gaze, and Christiana, sitting frozen in her chair with Blue still asleep against her chest, felt like she was watching two men have an entire conversation in a language made of silences and small smiles. Starting tomorrow. Of course, Taesung said. Whatever you need, you should rest. His eyes moved finally to Christiana, and this time they didn't slide past her. They settled, studied, catalogued. Though I have to say I'm curious. The cleaning staff aren't usually present during recovery consultations. She's leaving, Jumong said. Now. It wasn't unkind, but it was final, and Christiana found herself moving before she'd fully processed it. Standing, adjusting Blue against her shoulder, murmuring something that might have been thank you or might have been nothing at all, and walking past Taesung toward the door. As she passed him, his eyes dropped briefly to Blue's face, sleeping peacefully, fever-broken, safe, and lingered there just a beat too long, before flicking back up to meet Christiana's eyes with a small, polite smile that made every hair on the back of her neck stand up. She didn't look back as she left the room, but she felt his eyes on her the entire way down the hall. 3 days passed, and Christiana's life rearranged itself so quietly and so completely that it felt less like good fortune and more like waking up in someone else's house. Her wage, exactly as promised, had been adjusted, not by a small amount, but by enough that the eviction notice, when she finally called the landlord, simply resolved itself. The months of back rent paid in full through a transfer she hadn't initiated and couldn't trace. Blue's pediatrician appointment, scheduled for the following week, had somehow already been paid for, along with a referral to a specialist Christiana hadn't even known existed, for a follow-up on the fever that the ER doctor had mentioned almost in passing. She tried twice to bring it up with Ju Mong during her nightly rounds that continued, because apparently nothing about her assignment to room 317 had changed, except that now, instead of cleaning around a motionless body, she was cleaning around a man who was awake, sitting up, working through physical therapy exercises with grim determination, and watching her with an attentiveness that made her deeply uncomfortable. "This is too much," she said on the third night, setting down a stack of fresh towels. "The wage thing, the medical bills, I don't know how you're doing it and I don't want to know, but it's too much. I can pay you back. I will pay you back." "You won't," Jumong said simply, not looking up from the resistance band wrapped around his forearm. "It's not charity," Christiana said, echoing his own words back at him, "but it's also not normal. People don't just rearrange someone's entire financial life because they spent 3 weeks talking to someone who couldn't talk back." He looked up at her then, and something in his expression was almost gentle, which was somehow more unsettling than anything else about this entire situation. "I told you, it's not a gift. You kept me anchored to something real when there was nothing else. I'm not in the habit of leaving debts unpaid." "This isn't a debt, this is..." Christiana struggled for the word. "This is insane. You don't even know me. You don't know my last name. You don't know anything about..." "Christiana Reed," Jumong said. 29. From Lagos originally. Your accent, when you're tired, has an edge to it that comes through more. Single mother. Daughter's name is Blue, she's 2. She has a stuffed rabbit named Mister that she once put in the toilet. He set down the resistance band. "I know more about you than almost anyone in my life, Ms. Reed. That's rather the point." Christiana stared at him, something cold settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying realization of just how much of herself she'd given away to a room she thought was empty. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "What is this place? Why does the man with the hawk pin look at my daughter like she's a..." She stopped herself, but it was too late. "Like she's a what?" Jumong's voice had changed, sharpened, all gentleness gone, replaced by something cold and immediate. "Nothing I shouldn't have." "Christiana," he said her name like a command. "What did Taesung do?" "Nothing," he just looked at her. "For too long. It was probably nothing. I'm probably just tired and paranoid. But Jumong was no longer looking at her. He was reaching for the phone on the bedside table again, and this time his hands were moving with a speed and precision that didn't match a man 3 days out of a 3-week coma, dialing a number from memory. And when the call connected, he spoke in rapid Korean, his voice low and absolutely without warmth, and Christiana caught only one phrase she understood, repeated twice, urgent. Her apartment, now. Across the city, in the dim glow of a parking garage, two men sat in a black sedan parked across the street from a modest apartment building, watching a single lit window on the fourth floor where, every night around this time, a woman named Mrs. Oylerin put a 2-year-old named Blue to bed. One of the men checked his watch. "He's awake," he said in a low voice to the phone pressed against his ear. "Faster than we planned for. The boss wants to know if we proceed anyway." A pause, then on the other end of the line, calm and unhurried. "Proceed. If anything, this makes it better. Let's see how strong Jumong really is when something he's already decided to protect goes missing." The man hung up, looked at his partner, and nodded once toward the building. The phone in Jumong's hand rang back within 90 seconds, which, Christiana would later understand, was the sound of an empire moving exactly as fast as its leader demanded. "They're already there," Jumong said, after a brief exchange in Korean, his eyes meeting Christiana's. Two men, parked across from the building, watching the apartment. Christiana's blood turned to ice. "Mrs. Oylerin, Blue's things are still there, her crib, her..." She was already moving, already reaching for her phone, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "I have to call her, I have to get her out." "Don't call," Jumong said sharply, and the command in his voice cut through her panic enough to make her stop. "If her phone is being monitored, a warning call tells them we know. Right now, that's the only advantage we have." He was already pulling the IV from his arm, not carefully, not the way a nurse would, but with the brutal efficiency of a man who had clearly done this before, in worse circumstances, and didn't have time for gentleness. Blood welled at the injection site. He pressed a gauze pad against it without looking, eyes still on Christiana. "Get Blue, now. We're not waiting for an ambulance escort or a security detail. We move now while they still think I'm bedridden." "You can barely stand." "I can stand," Jumong said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed with a wince he didn't bother hiding. "Well enough." He was wrong, mostly. His legs, after 3 weeks of total atrophy, buckled the moment they took his weight, and he caught himself hard against the bed frame, jaw tight, breath sharp through his nose. But he didn't go down. He stood there, shaking, gripping the frame, and looked up at Christiana with an expression that left absolutely no room for argument. "Help me to the chair," he said, "then get your daughter." What followed was the strangest 15 minutes of Christiana's life. Jumong, dressed in borrowed clothes brought by a guard who clearly knew better than to ask questions, moving through the hospital's service corridors in a wheelchair, he refused to actually sit still in, barking quiet instructions into a phone, while Christiana ran 2 floors down to wake Blue from a nap in the hospital daycare where she'd been staying, scooping her sleepy daughter into her arms and trying to explain nothing. Because there was nothing she could explain that would make any of this make sense. By the time they reached the underground garage, a car was already waiting, black, unmarked, engine running, and 2 more of Jumong's men were loading something into the trunk that Christiana very deliberately did not look at too closely. "Where are we going?" she asked, climbing into the back seat with Blue, who was awake now and clinging to her, sensing without understanding that something was wrong. "Not to your apartment," Jumong said, settling into the front seat with visible effort, still pale, still moving like every motion cost him something. "Mrs. Oylerin is already being moved. My people are there now, should have her and your things out within minutes. We're going somewhere safer, somewhere T-Sung doesn't know about yet." "T-Sung did this." "T-Sung," Jumong said grimly, "or whoever T-Sung has been quietly working with for the last 3 weeks while everyone assumed I was dying." He turned just slightly to look at her, and at Blue, wide-eyed and silent in Christiana's lap. "There's a man in Busan, runs the 2nd largest syndicate on the peninsula. He's wanted my territory for a decade and never had the nerve to try while I was." He paused. "While I was present. 3 weeks ago, someone got past my security and put 4 bullets in me. I've spent every hour since I woke up trying to figure out who. I think I just did. And he knows about me." "He knows," Jumong said quietly. That you're the only person I've protected since I woke up, which makes you the only leverage anyone's found that I actually care about." The words sat in the car like a held breath. Christiana looked down at Blue, who had stopped clinging and was now simply staring up at Ju Mong with the open, unguarded curiosity that only small children seem to have left in them. No fear, no understanding of danger, just quiet interest in this tired, tattooed man who had let her sleep on his chest 3 nights ago. "I'm sorry," Ju Mong said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he sounded like he meant it in a way that went beyond politeness. "This is my world. It was never supposed to touch yours." "It already did," Christiana said quietly. "3 weeks ago, I just didn't know it yet." The safe house was a quiet apartment on the edge of the city, unremarkable from the outside, and for the first hour after they arrived, nothing happened at all. Just Ju Mong on the phone, voice low and constant, coordinating something Christiana couldn't follow, while Blue, exhausted, finally fell asleep on a couch with Mr. the Rabbit clutched to her chest. Then, just after midnight, Ju Mong's phone rang once, and he answered, listened for nearly a full minute without speaking, and then said only, "Confirmed?" A pause. "Then we move tonight, all of it." He hung up and looked at Christiana, who'd been watching from across the room, arms wrapped around herself. "T-Sung made his play," he said. "Tonight, while I'm supposedly unable to respond. He's meeting with the Busan Syndicate's people in person, first time in years they've risked it. He thinks I'm still recovering. He thinks I don't know." "But you do." "I do now." He stood, slower than before but steadier, and for a moment something passed across his face that Christiana hadn't seen there yet, not the cold calculation from the hospital, not the gentleness from their conversations, but something underneath both of those things. Tired, almost sad. "For 3 weeks, the only thing keeping me alive was a voice telling me about a stuffed rabbit and an eviction notice. And the first thing I do when I wake up is go back to this. Wars, traitors, men in parking garages. I told myself, lying in that bed, that if I survived, things would be different. And here I am." "So make them different," Christiana said quietly. "After tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. "After tonight," he said. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its precision. Ju Mong's people, mobilized in the hours since his awakening, converged on the meeting between T-Sung and the Busan emissaries before the meeting had even properly begun. And by the time Ju Mong himself arrived, against every protest from everyone around him, walking with the support of a cane and the sheer force of will, it was already over. T-Sung was on his knees in a warehouse office, surrounded, the Busan emissaries already neutralized, and the evidence of 3 weeks of quiet betrayal laid out on a table between them. Transferred funds, falsified reports, a contract on Ju Mong's life with T-Sung's signature on the authorization. Ju Mong looked at it all for a long moment. Then he looked at T-Sung. 20 years, he said quietly. "You were with me for 20 years. T-Sung didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. "The council will hear all of it," Ju Mong said, turning away. "Tomorrow, every member. I want them to understand exactly what almost happened here and exactly why it didn't." The next morning, in an apartment that finally felt quiet in a way that didn't feel like holding a breath, Christiana sat at a small kitchen table while Blue, fully recovered, full of energy, utterly unbothered by the events of the last 12 hours, climbed onto the couch beside Ju Mong, who was resting with his sleeve rolled up, the dragon tattoo on his forearm catching the morning light. Blue reached out and, with the focused seriousness only a toddler could bring to such a task, began tracing the lines of the tattoo with one small finger. Ju Mong didn't move, didn't pull away. He sat very still, watching the small finger trace dragons and geometric patterns across skin that had been marked over the years by a life built entirely on control, on being the most dangerous person in any room, on never being touched, never being vulnerable, never allowing anyone close enough to matter. "That tickles," he said quietly, and Blue giggled, delighted, and kept going. Christiana watched from the kitchen table, coffee in hand, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight for years. The constant, exhausting calculation of a life lived entirely alone, the belief that needing anyone was a weakness she couldn't afford. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Any of this. We can go back to our apartment. You don't owe us." "I know," Jumong said, still watching Blue's finger trace a line down his arm. "I'm not doing it because I owe you." He looked up at Christiana, and for the first time since the night 4 bullets had nearly ended his life, his expression held nothing calculated in it at all. "I'm doing it," he said, "because for 3 weeks, a voice in the dark was the only real thing in my world, and I'd like to find out what it's like to listen to it while I'm awake." Outside, the city moved on, unaware that somewhere in it, a man who had spent his entire life believing that power meant control had just discovered something else entirely, and that the woman across the table from him, who'd spent years believing she could only survive alone, had just let someone in.